gives me great pleasure to be here at the launch of Dr. Can you hear me? Can you hear? Okay. At the launch of Dr. Waterman's critical study, History, Memory, and Fiction, New Dimensions of Contemporary Pakistani and Kashmiri Writing, which reveals his continuing interest in Pakistani Anglophone literature and also the links between history and literature, the public and the personal.
Yeah, I don't think they're hearing you so well, Muneeza.
Can you hear me? Well,
I'm seeing signs that say speak up.
Can you hear me now? Oh, well, I'll have to, okay. Turn around a bit. Okay, is that better? Well, all right, okay. The book covers 8 works of excellence, both fiction and memoirs, and it is also significant because 2 of these books are by Kashmiri writers from India, Mirza Waheed and Basharat Peer, whose writing is discussed alongside specific works by Pakistani writers, although I hasten to add that the Kashmiri conflict is only one aspect of the book, which has a much wider trajectory, and it moves across Kashmir, urban Pakistan, Afghanistan, the diaspora, and indeed the colonial past and the imaginary future. The Pakistani authors he discusses are Sonia Kamal, Mohsin Hamid, Nadeem Aslam, Uzma Aslam Khan, and Osama Siddiq. In History, Memory, and Fiction, the novel and creative memoirs that Dr. Waterman explores are rooted in facts, but they explore the spaces in between. And by doing so, they throw new light onto historical events. As such, his analysis looks at the way in which imagination and storytelling, including the use of symbolism, metaphor, and the surreal, can reveal how political events and conflict impact nations and their citizens beyond selective ideological or political narratives or stereotype perceptions. He covers many topical, political, and universal issues today, including geopolitics and the quest for a better life. All the books he discusses are works of some excellence, and he makes a fascinating comment on conflict, movement, adaptation, and change. The book is divided into 4 sections. Kashmir, which looks at Sonia Kamal's novel, The Isolated Incident, and Mirza Waheed's The Collaborator. Part 2, The Personal is Political, which looks at Rafia Zakaria's memoir, The Upstairs Wife, and that of Basharat Peer, The Curfewed Night. And also, in the same section, you have Mohsin Hamid's novel in the form of a self-help book, How to Get Filthy Rich in Rising Asia. Part 3, War, explores Nadeem Aslam's The Wasted Vigil, which is set in war-riven Afghanistan, and Usma Aslam Khan's The Miraculous History of Nomi Ali, which is set in World War II during colonial rule. And then last of all, you have Migration, Part 4, and that looks at Mohsin Hamid's Exit West and Osama Siddiq's Snuffing Out the Moon. The book is a welcome addition to Dr. Waterman's previous work on Pakistani English literature. He's done a book called Where Worlds Collide, Pakistani Fiction in the New Millennium. And interestingly, he's also done a book on conflict and trauma in European literature, writers such as Anthony Burgess, Pat Parker, and Doris Lessing. So now I'm going to start asking some questions, and which is, I begin with, what led to your interest in Pakistan, and how did you discover, these writers, and what led to the book?
Well, first of all, I should say thank you to everybody for being here. Thanks. And thanks especially to Muneeza, because who else would it be on stage with me if it's not Muneeza Shamsie, who's been one of my top resource people ever since the beginning of my interest in Pakistani Anglophone literature. How did I get interested in Pakistan? Well, I've always been interested in historical fiction. In fact, it's about the only genre that interests me, historical fiction. And if I if I've always been interested in that, I worked primarily in contemporary British. You've mentioned Doris Lessing. Pat Barker, for example, was a big interest for me. And then about 2008, after I'd finished a book on Pat Barker's work, I was looking for a new direction to go in where I could be a little more original in what I was doing. Sometimes I had the impression I was just adding to the pile, and I wanted to do something a little more original. And in looking around, I'd always been fascinated with India. It goes back to my master's thesis when I looked at a lot of Indian philosophy, Greater India, in the work of T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets, for example. And I'd always been fascinated with the subcontinent just because it's such a big, diverse place that it's always fascinated me ever since I was a kid and had happy feet, and wanted to discover the big wide world. And so I was looking what to do, and I'd noticed that in the United States and in the UK, a lot of people in the universities were paying attention to Pakistani Anglophone literature, and nobody in France was doing that, just nobody. And so I said, well, here's where I could maybe make a more original contribution and help promote that literature in France. And so I read a book called A Case of Exploding Mangoes, which you all know. And that book really got me hooked on Pakistani Anglophone literature because it was historical fiction, it was satire, and I've always believed that humor can be a very potent political weapon, okay? And the literature that was coming out of Pakistan was very political in many, many ways, because I'm a literary guy who does not, I don't approach literature in a literary way. I approach literature in a much more political way, in a much more social representations sort of approach. I'm interested not only in those macro histories that the pure historians will work on, but in the micro histories that we don't necessarily have traces of those in the archives. And that's where fiction can help you fill in those gaps. And Pakistani literature just lent itself to that, to my kind of approach that I enjoyed.
Well, when it comes to this particular book, your last book, of course, dealt with 9 other writers, the newer writers, the new millennium, the post-2001 writers. But this is specific to certain subjects.
Yes.
And what led you to include Mirza Waheed and Basharat Peer? What do they add to the narrative?
Well, we have this place called Kashmir, which has been contested for a long, long time now. And even though I organized the book into 4 sections, there's a great deal of overlap and permeability in those sections. And the kinds of things that interest me are how even fact can be influenced by myth and tradition and folklore, and many of the things that we take as fact actually aren't. And vice versa. And I wanted to do not only work in the novel form, but I wanted to look at some memoirs too, because the memoirs I look at, and I think I say it somewhere, if you read them, they read like a novel actually. They're well done in a storytelling sort of a way. And it seemed to me that the novels and the memoirs were working in much the same way, because they, in the same way that the historical archives always have gaps, they're always incomplete. Human memories, too. And whether you're writing a factual memoir or a factual history, that always has to do with interpretation and with, these kinds of impressions that we can't necessarily prove in the same way. Psychologizing people, getting inside people's heads, what they were thinking at the time, the kind of thing that leaves no trace in the archives. And it seemed to me that they added that as well.
Yes, well, I found these 2 writers very interesting, but what Sonia Kamal's isolated incident, as far as I know, is the only Pakistani English fiction novel to be actually located in Kashmir. She begins in occupied Kashmir, and then it's got the diaspora, and then it's got Pakistan. Can you comment on that and its relationship to Mirza Waheed's collaborator?
Well, the two kind of come together. The links between the two are the idea that, for example, in Kamazda, an isolated incident, you have the young boy who's grown up with stories of his family being the proud freedom fighters, and he has that tradition that he carries along with him, and then he is seduced by that, goes to Kashmir to become a freedom fighter, discovers on the ground that things aren't at all like that, right? And it manages to survive and come back. And so this idea that, that what? I'm having trouble articulating what I want to say here. That, and then of course with Mirza Wahid, we're in the Vale of Kashmir, and
Yes.
It's a beautiful area, one of the most beautiful places on earth, and yet it's full of dead bodies. And once again, the idea that the narrative, the dominant narrative, coming from the drunken Indian captain, is that, you know, we're killing these terrorists and things, but the people who live there are paying the price for all of this ongoing war and violence.
I was actually very interested in your exploration of different forms of migration. Of course, in Sonia's novel, you have a girl and she goes from Kashmir and to America, and a boy who comes back to Pakistan and so on. But in India, you then draw the next section. You have Basharat Peer in Kashmir, and then you have Rafia Zakaria's upstairs wife in Karachi, and then Mohsin Hamid's How to Get Filthy Rich. And somehow you link these, the different forms of migration. Can you comment on this?
Well,
Where's
they're
the
different
migration?
Yeah, they're different forms of migration, and they're also those sort of, because in Pakistan, of course, well, everybody knows that this is where the biggest human migration in human history happened, and so you have these mega migrations in Pakistan, but you also have these micro migrations from, like, the second wife moving up to the second floor and things like that.
Yes.
And of course, all of that can be linked into what the philosopher Thomas Nail has called kenopolitics, right? Where movement is always political. It's never just spontaneous. We don't just say, oh, we're going to move. We have to move for one reason or another, be they economic, because of war, or whatever. And I'm always interested, as I say, in how those micro-histories can inform the macro-histories, which is what happens a lot in those particular works. In Filthy Rich, for example, you have the young boy who gets rich selling water, right?
So that's his migration, isn't it? It's from...
Yeah, and then, exactly, and then he is able to become rich, but at great personal cost to his personal life.
Yes.
And it seemed to me that that was a microcosm for, you know, much of what happens in Pakistan, where you know, there's just a little too much self-help going on and not quite enough solidarity in some ways.
Well, that's really nice. We had actually been discussing colonialism and post-colonialism, and A Wasted Vigil and Miraculous History of Nomi Ali are actually completely different novels. I mean, but again, you've got an occupying power, you've got a war going on in Afghanistan in The Wasted Vigil, and in Nomi Ali you have the British occupation of the Andaman Islands, the penal colony, and then you have the Japanese. Can you comment on the links or the disparities between the two?
Yeah, well, once again, that was those novels were linked under war because war was obviously the backdrop, but once again, it was the idea that they were both historical fiction, whether we're talking about the Afghan War or the Andaman Islands in World War II, under the two different occupiers then. And what brought them together for me was the sense that in fiction, if we were reading just a purely historical account, just a chronicle of those events, it would be just description. Whereas here, because we're doing historical fiction, we're able to provide all of those details about the suffering and the pain, and in fact in Nomi Ali there's that wonderful scene where the prisoner who escapes she's erased. Her trace in the prison records is completely erased because the authorities don't want to admit that anyone has ever escaped from that prison. And so then when the Western journalists come and are asking for the story, they're talking to the local people, and the people are saying, oh yes, there was this woman, a prisoner, she escaped. But the Western journalists won't believe her.
Yes.
Because they don't find a trace in the archives. And see, that's where I think historical fiction can fill in. And Nomi Ali was the perfect example of that, with filling in those details, which we can't necessarily prove, and yet they might be true. So we're talking about the creation of plausible histories, plausible stories. And I think that's where I'm a big believer that fiction, especially historical fictions, if they're really done well and with good faith, that should become part of the historical archive, because I think there's a lot that we can learn from fiction, even though we can't necessarily prove it in the same way that a physicist could prove this or that, or a chemist could prove this or that. And I think that my definition of the archive is very, very large.
Actually, they're quite interesting because both books, I mean, in Wasted Vigils, you've got Americans, you've got Afghans, you've got Pakistanis, you've got Russians. This is sort of a great interaction of communities and people, and they converge. And in Nomi Ali, you've got the British, you've got the Japanese, you've got the Indians, you've got the Burmese. It's very fascinating. And in a way, that brings me, again, to the last section of your book, is, well, partly migration, movement, different forms of movement, because in Mohsin Hamid's Exit West, he's moving across countries to different lands. And in Osama Sadiq's, he's spanning so many centuries from antiquity to now, so he's moving across time. Mm-hmm. Can you comment on movement, and also what is the advantage of using magic realism or surrealism in these novels?
Well, movement, I mean, the entire history of humanity is the history of movement, right? And if anybody tells you you come from a pure culture, there are only two possibilities. One, they haven't looked deeply enough or far enough back, or two, they have a political agenda that they're trying to bring across. Now, I don't know what it's like here in Pakistan. Actually, I do. But in Europe, the lunatic right-wing parties are using, migration, the migration issue as, oh my goodness, we're being invaded by these hordes and everything like that, especially Muslim hordes, right?
Yeah.
And the whole idea and what troubles me with that is that if the history of humanity is the history of movement, why are we always so excited about migration and immigration? I mean, we probably don't want to live in a world of completely open doors. We want to be able to keep an eye on the bad guys. But it seems to me that that kind of movement is not only to be tolerated, but just encouraged. And I mean, my ancestors were poor immigrants from Ireland and Germany who moved to the United States looking for a better life, and that's nothing unusual at all. Magic realism is a wonderful way of showing how those migrants could move without going through the proper checkpoints, right? And of course, the authorities are very nervous about that. They're worried about the end of civilization. And of course, at the end of the novel, we see that, yeah, there were some difficulties of adjustment, but that in fact, it was going okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that whole political idea that movement needs to be controlled politically and ideologically, and anyway. The political aspects of movement.
Well, I think we're running out of time. I just want to ask you a final question. You and Paul Verret have recently edited, co-edited an online journal called Angles on Naya Pakistan, New Pakistan. Can you tell us a little about it?
Yeah, Paul Verret, my colleague from the University of Bordeaux-Montaigne, and I were invited to do a special issue on Naya, what we decided to call Naya Pakistan. Don't know where we got that idea from. But, and we accepted quite a few articles, and it's online now, Angles, like Angles. And it's the official journal of our learned society for the what we call the SRS, the Learned Society for English Teachers in France. And we put that together online, so have a visit to Angles. The articles are there, and then there are some interspersed with video clips. We've even got the rap singer Ava B in there too, if you're interested. So have a look at our recent edition of Angles. We're pretty happy. 15 years ago, not too many people were looking at Anglophone literature from Pakistan in France. And since Paul and I have been sort of flying the Pakistan flag in France, we've noticed lately that some more PhD theses are being defended on Pakistani Anglophone literature. It's starting to become more popular. It's getting roots there. And of course, some of the bigger name writers, Kamala as one, have been translated into French. And so it's catching on, as you can imagine, a bit more slowly than in the Anglophone countries. But we're pretty happy with how things are going.
Thank you. Is there any questions from the audience?
So your work on Pat Barker, is it published?
Yeah.
Is it available here?
No.
Can you, oh, okay.
Yeah, so it's not available here,
Oh,
your work on
I can't
Pat
imagine they have
Barker.
it here, no.
Is it a book with Pat Barker, Doris Lessing, and one more writer you mentioned?
Well, I wrote a book on Pat. I wrote a book on Pat Barker, and I wrote one on Doris Lessing's space fiction, and those are all available on Amazon or any of those big, any of those big booksellers. But I can't imagine they have that here. I'm not that famous.
If you gave it to Oxford University Press, maybe they'll publish it.
I'm not sure the contract allows for that, but.
Okay.
No, my last two books have been with Oxford. I'm under contract with Oxford now, but all of the 10 books before that were with other publishers.
Thanks.
There's one more question. Is Sarah, can you, oh, over there, at the back.
Hi. I must confess to being a bit ignorant and not being familiar with your work.
Oh.
But I'm fascinated by the idea of using literary fiction as contributing to the historical archive. I think that's wonderful. But I just wondered, in your work, do you also do any literary criticism, or is it simply just reporting on, or simply analyzing the role of the particular writers or writing in contribution to history?
Yeah, I'm a literary guy, but my work has been criticized because I don't use a literary approach, and so for 35 years now, people have been saying, "Oh, you claim to be a literary guy, and you're much more political." My undergraduate degree, in fact, is in social psychology. You see, and that sort of framework has stuck with me ever since, and I won't apologize for that. And so, when I read almost anything, I'm not. If you're looking for a truly literary critique, you're not going to find that in my work. You're going to find social representation, how this particular representation normalizes certain ideologies, things like that. What kind of political agenda is going on here? What kinds of resistance are going on here? Because after all, the British Empire, they colonized half the planet, and yet some of the most eloquent voices of resistance were coming out of the British Empire too. And so those are the kinds of things that animate me in my work. But if you're looking for truly literary criticism, I don't do that. And the reason is simple. It's because I'm not smart enough, I'm not sensitive enough to understand art. I'm more of a boots on the ground kind of guy. I mean, I'm an ex-ambulance driver, you know. What do I know about art? I know about boots on the ground.
Well, he does know about criticism. There's one more question there. They're very good books.
Is that better?
Yes.
Yes. It's basically a very simple question. I'm curious as to, of all the countries on this earth, why did you
decide to focus on Pakistan? What drew you to Pakistan?
What drew me to Pakistan? The food? Maybe. What drew me to Pakistan particularly? Well, when I came back to South Asia in 2008, I mean, not physically, but, you know, in my research interest, as you probably know, lots and lots of people are already in the Anglophone world anyway, are already working on India in France, right? And nobody was looking at Pakistan. And so I thought, hey, there's the perfect niche for me. And so I started reading lots and lots, and I knew that I had to go there because I'm not the kind of researcher who's going to sit in the library and in front of a computer screen to do all my work. And in 2011, I was at a conference in Istanbul, and two colleagues from IIUI up in Islamabad, we met, and they invited me to Pakistan, and I said, okay, here we go, and that sort of started the adventure. And of course, once I got here, you can imagine my first trip to Pakistan, I was a little nervous because in the Western media, the images that we get of Pakistan, it's all the bad stuff, right? And then, of course, after I'd been here once, I realized, well, there are many, many other chapters to the story of the history of Pakistan. And so I've been working here and working on those kinds of subjects ever since, and I haven't got bored yet. So I think that's going to keep me going until the day of my funeral. You can all be invited if you want, because we all leave unfinished projects behind us, right? We never quite finish everything we want to do.
Have we got time for one quick question? Any more questions?
Hamid's current book, The Last White Man.
Yeah?
I don't know if you've had the chance to read it.
I have.
And we have quite a lot of diverse opinions on it. So I'm looking forward to your analysis. I'm sure your next book will contain it. Will it?
Well, I've read it. I haven't done any work on it yet because I just laid hands on a copy just a few weeks ago. It's what I would call speculative fiction, okay, about, you know, sort of predicting, and I talk about that in this book too, the way that we need to look at the past and how we reconstruct our past according to our present interests, depending on what kind of possible futures we imagine for ourselves. And I think that book might be calling out for that kind of analysis. There's a lady there.
There's one last question, I think.
Yeah,
we're running
one
out
more.
of time.
Because then we have to make room for the next.
Zaitoon.
The schedule is tight.
Such a pleasure to hear you. You started your talk by mentioning humor as a very important ingredient of literature. And I was wondering if you have anything to say about the specific qualities and dimensions of Pakistani humor and humor as distinct from other intercultural humors.
I think the Pakistanis are experts at self-deprecating humor. I really do. Yeah. And I think they're very good at using political humor as kind of a weapon too. But self-deprecating humor, I would say, is the very strong point of Pakistanis. Somebody like me who comes along and criticizes you, oh, that might not go over so well, but you criticize yourselves all the time. And so that's one of the things that's always impressed me is that Pakistanis have they see very clearly what's going on.
Thank you so much. I'm going to sign saying time is out. It's been really great talking to you, David. And, well, I enjoyed the book a lot. Thank you.